Christina Resnikoff. I am the internship coordinator and office administrator out here at Camp Gym. I joined full-time staff this past fall, and I have been on staff in various aspects since 2014 here. And I'm just super excited to be a part of a team that just is super excited about sharing the love of Jesus with campers and guests alike. So over these next few devotions this week, I'm going to be reading through Philippians 4 verses 4 to 7 and just sharing how those verses have really impacted my life and going through a lot of personal testimony through all of that. So if you like stories and personal testimony, this is a devotion for you. If you don't like stories and personal testimony, this is still a devotion for you. So let me tell you a story then. Imagine this. There's a young woman. She thinks she has her life all figured out, as young women obviously do all the time in their life. And so she's just finished college. She's in her internship at camp, and she's just really excited for where she feels like God is calling her to next in the step that makes sense, and that is overseas missions, of course. And so she applies to an organization. She goes through the interview process. She goes through the lots of paperwork and all of that, and gets accepted onto this team in an overseas mission for 2 years. So now she has to just finish up the rest of her internship, and she waits in nervous anticipation for September to come around. Finally, it's September, and she gets to pack up and head down to the cities for a week long of intensive support raising training. She's going to be meeting a bunch of people that are going to be sent all over the world, and for the same common purpose of how do we support raise, how do we join people invite people into being a part of our team. So support raising training comes and goes. She comes to the end of it, and she has 20 appointments for the next upcoming week here. She's really excited for the chance to talk to her friends and family about what God is doing and how they can be a part of what God's doing overseas through her, whether it's through their finances or prayerfully. We're fast forwarding a couple months, and so the first couple months of support raising goes super well. And now it's November, it's Thanksgiving, it's coming up to be Christmas time, and things start to slow down with support raising. She just kind of attributes that to the holidays and doesn't think much of it and just enjoys her time with her family. She enjoys just the rest and just the rejuvenation as January is about to come up, and she can be able to kick things back off. So we're mid-January now, and she is counseling at the teen retreat at camp. And the speaker that weekend is talking about discerning God's will for your life. And for whatever reason, that hits her harder than she was expecting. And through that weekend, she starts hearing God telling her, this isn't what I want for you. Stop following this path. I have something better for you. She kind of ignores those thoughts, doesn't tell anybody about it for a couple months, and just continues support raising, just assuming that everything's going to go absolutely amazing. Little does she know, ignoring those thoughts doesn't exactly help her. She doesn't allow other people to come alongside her and pray for her and speak into her. So it's about the end of February time, and she's starting to hear these thoughts from the Lord again, starting to hear his voice saying, stop following this path. This isn't where you're supposed to be going. Just trust me in this. So she actually tells her support coach, she tells a couple of her closest friends about this, and they're able to pray with her and speak life into her and just encourage her and just come alongside her in these really hard times here. So she has a lot of hours just crying out to God, seeking his guidance on this, and basically trying to answer the question, is this what I want, or is this what you want, God? So at the end of many hours and many days of crying out to God, she clearly hears the Lord's voice tell her, you're not going. And that made her cry a lot. She didn't want to hear that. That's not what made sense to her. What made sense to her was going overseas. And this was a really difficult time for her. So she just continues to pray about what it might look like to be in overseas missions, or if she's supposed to continue even joining this team. So over a couple weeks, she prays with her support coach and with other people, and they decide that just going for the summer is what makes sense. What is definitely what God is calling her to, because she has the funds for that, almost perfectly the amount that she needs for the summer. So she decides to continue leaning on that. And for the next couple months, she's just working, she's praying, she's preparing herself for the summer. So summer comes, it's the day that she's leaving, and a lot of tears were shed as she says goodbye to her loved ones. She's not expecting what the next 24 hours, 48 hours will bring her. The next 24 hours include a lot of things, like she gets on a plane, and flights are delayed and she misses her connecting flight at Chicago. But that was a huge blessing in disguise. She got to spend the day with her cousin. And then she gets on the plane to head overseas. And while she's on that plane, she has a migraine for basically the entire time. She can't see things very well. She has a terrible nausea and just is unable to kind of focus on anything around her. She's finally landing overseas and she's super excited for where God's calling her to. The headache is kind of subsiding. So she thinks, yes, God's definitely going to redeem this and I'm definitely going to be able to rejoice in him through this. So then she comes up to immigration, and that's a story for another time, but a lot of craziness ensues there. And at the end of it, she's given 2 weeks to leave the country. So she's in this country. She doesn't know anybody. She has nobody that she can confide in except for God. She has nobody's arms she can run into to seek comfort from. So she has the next 4 hours to spend on a bus, just kind of processing through things with God and allowing him to work through her and speak to her in that. During those 2 short weeks, she knows that God doesn't waste anything, so she just allows God to use her in whatever ministry that is going to happen. And out there, even though she felt really lonely and out of place, God still did use her. She was able to minister to the locals there, and God spoke to her in ways she hasn't experienced before. So she comes to the end of the 2 short weeks, and she's heading back home to Minnesota, and those flights were the easiest flights she's ever experienced before. She gets back home and is given a warm embrace by her friends back in the airport. So if you didn't figure this out already, that young woman was me. That was about 1.5 years of my life where I was called overseas, or what I felt like was being called overseas. And there was a lot of chaos that was happening. It was a lot of unsure things, and it was really hard for me to find ways to rejoice in the Lord. So this first devotion, I'm going to focus on Philippians 4:4, and what that says is this: rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. So in this, Paul is telling the Philippian church to rejoice through uncertain and difficult times. Have you ever noticed that in scripture when the Lord repeats something, you better pay attention? In this verse, Paul is saying rejoice twice. And that really stands out to me. So as we go through the rest of this devotional, just think, what is joy to you? It could mean many things. So I just want to go over, what is the difference between joy and happiness? Do you think there's a difference? I think that there is a difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is a temporary emotion. It's what you feel when your dog greets you when you come back home. It's what you feel when your kid or a loved young one in your life does something that you're really proud of. It's what you feel when you see that sunset at the end of a really good day. Happiness is something that fleets. Anything can change it, something can come along and change your happiness there. But the thing about joy is that it's one of the fruits of the Spirit. It is eternal. It is something that God gives us. It is a gift that he gives us. I was reading a devotion the other day, and it says this: the modern world does not encourage joy in God. Instead, we're taught to value possessions, power, and position. But true joy is not found in those things. John 15:1-11 says that joy comes from abiding in Christ's love. In Philippians 2:2, joy flows from believers being united in love, spirit, and purpose. John says that complete joy means to be united with the Father, Jesus, and other believers in 1 John. I'm in complete agreement with all of these things, so take time to reflect on those verses. I'll have them in the description down below for you. So, do you think that this verse is saying that as Christians we're supposed to be joyful all the time, we're supposed to be happy all the time? I don't think so. The Bible never tells us that as Christians life is going to be 100% easy. There are going to be times in your life that come along and you just have to rely on God to give you joy. During this period of my life where I was super uncertain and I just wasn't sure what was going on, I had to still seek joy from the Lord. And through all of that, there were little things that he placed in my life. I was able to rejoice in a day with my cousin. I was able to rejoice in seeing a new part of God's creation, and just a very beautiful part of God's creation. I was able to rejoice in the fact that this is going to be a part of my testimony someday, as somebody might come along and not exactly sure what's going to happen in their life. I can use my story to encourage them in that. So during this coronavirus season, what are some things that you can be rejoicing in? Even though things might be uncertain, you might be losing your jobs, you might be getting really overwhelmed with your kids being home and not exactly sure what social distance learning is looking like. And you can't seem to see the end of the tunnel. Just find ways to rejoice in the Lord and just know that His joy is unfleeting through this. Here's a final quote to keep you thinking as we end this year. So true joy is found only in Jesus, out of John 15:11. If we look for God's work and gifts in our lives, we will always have joy. If we get caught up in temporary hardships and worldly desires, our joy will be fleeting and weak. Even in hardship, our joy remains because it depends on God and His promises. Out of Isaiah 35:10, it says this, "And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away." So this is my prayer for you guys. May joy be everlasting in your life. May you continue to feel this gift of the Lord and just continue to find ways to rejoice in God through everything in your life. So over this next week, I'm going to challenge myself and I challenge you. How can you rejoice in the Lord through uncertain times? How can you see the Lord continuing to work in your life? Comment below when you find ways to rejoice. God bless.